The Erasure of Indigenous Language and Culture, Canadian Residential Schools. The erasure of Indigenous language and culture can't be discussed without addressing the devastating impact of residential schools. We must take a look at the past before we address the present and the future. Together, we will also explore the efforts being made to preserve and revive Indigenous culture and language. The first recollection of Canadian residential schools began as early as 1620 in Quebec. Created by the Christian churches and the Canadian government, the main goal of residential schools was to assimilate Indigenous children into their Eurocentric society. The Canadian government created policies in hopes to abolish Indigenous governments, ignore Indigenous people's rights, and terminate the treaties. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation describes residential schools as cultural genocide. The Bagot Report suggested that Indigenous children be taken from their homes. In 1876, the government took advantage of Indigenous people's rights in education through the Indian Act. In 1883, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorized the creation of residential schools. This was an effort to separate Indigenous children from their families. First Nations children ages 7 to 16 years old were required to attend these residential schools. In 1922, Dr. Peterson Bryce exposed the high death rate of Indigenous children due to poor health conditions. By 1930, there were over 80 residential schools open at one time. At this time, I'd like to share the story of 77-year-old Squamish Nation elder Sam George, who is a survivor of the St. Paul's Indian Residential School. He shared his story with CTV News. In 1952, he was just 7 years old when his father dropped him off with his 3 siblings to St. Paul's Indian Residential School. "It wasn't a school," Sam said. "It was a place to kill the Indian in us. You know, I learned how to read and write, but at what price?" The discovery of 215 children in unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in 2021 brought back devastating memories for Sam. From the very first day at residential school, he was subjected to physical abuse. He had to obey the nuns, or else he would be punished. He remembers being punished for reasons he didn't even understand at such a young age. He was 13 years old when the sexual abuse began. He recalls his classmates running away from the school as well, and he suspected that they were also being sexually abused. Sam tried to run away from the school as well, but every time he did, the RCMP officers would find him and bring him back to the school. He shared a haunting memory of a nun asking him to dig a hole with his brother in the school's garden. "It was a hole about 4 feet long and maybe 2 feet wide and about 3 or 4 feet deep," Sam George said. The nuns insisted it was a hole to put garbage in. Sam left the institution at 15 years old when the school closed in 1959. The trauma of the abuse he endured left him feeling angry and in pain. This led him into a cycle of drugs and alcohol through his adult years. He ended up going to jail between the ages of 15 to 20 for charges of violence and stealing. The abuse and separation from siblings at the institution would go to affect George's future. The trauma of being separated from his siblings at the school would go on to affect his family and his future relationships. Later in life, he went on to separate from his wife, the mother of his 2 children. At 45 years old, he took it more seriously to return to his culture and be in charge of his sobriety. He became more involved in the joys of his culture, such as singing, drumming, and dancing. Sam began to go to sweat lodges as a form of spirituality and to help with his healing. Through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, Sam was granted money for his testimony against the residential schools. He claims that the money didn't heal his pain. It was sharing his story that became part of his healing process. Sam George was one of thousands of children who were subjected to abuse at these residential schools. The schools were government funded but run by the churches themselves. The children were subjected to abuse by the nuns. Many of them suffered physical, verbal, and sexual abuse. The poor health conditions they experienced included malnutrition and neglect. The children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, and if they disobeyed, they would be punished. The children were stripped of their culture and languages and forced to convert to Christianity. The 60s scoop began in 1951. It was a term coined by Patrick Johnson when he wrote a research paper called Native Children and the Welfare System. It was a child welfare policy created by the Canadian government. Indigenous communities had become impoverished as an outcome of colonization. Changes were made to the Indian Act that allowed the government to remove Indigenous children from their homes and place them with non-Indigenous families. This was another attempt to assimilate Indigenous children. The impacts of the 60s scoop affected children's sense of identity and loss of culture. Some children were placed in abusive homes and were faced with many hardships later on. By the 1980s, a majority of the residential schools were shut down. The last federally run residential school closed in 1996. It is estimated that 6,000 children died in these residential schools. Many are unaccounted for. There are over 80,000 residential school survivors. In an effort to regain what was lost, there are many initiatives to preserve Indigenous languages and culture. According to a Statistics Canada 2011 census, there are over 60 Indigenous languages. Algonquin is the largest Indigenous language family identified in Canada. According to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Canada, their Indigenous languages represent a significant part of culture, identity, and general well-being of individuals, families, and communities. Indigenous languages like Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut are believed to have a higher chance of survival due to the large population of speakers. Indigenous communities are facing many challenges that can prevent them from preserving these languages. The rates of poverty, unemployment, life expectancy, suicide, school dropouts, infant mortality, health issues, inadequate welfare funding, or services are all significantly higher than the national average, according to the Assembly of First Nations. Indigenous communities are focused on improving their quality of life and gaining access to their basic rights. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada created a report in 2015 that outlined recommendations and calls to action for the Canadian government. This report was created to rectify the wrongdoings of the Canadian residential school system. These are the call to actions that highlight the significance of language and culture. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission encourages the Canadian government to increase funding for Aboriginal languages. To create some perspective, the combined total of the annual federal budget for these Aboriginal language programs are $9.1 million, compared to the $350 million annual budget for the official languages program for English and French. There needs to be more of an emphasis on integrating Indigenous language and culture into Canadian society and culture. The preservation and revitalization of Aboriginal languages are best managed by Aboriginal people and their communities. In response to the Commission's call to action number 14, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau enacted the Indigenous Languages Act, Bill C-91. Through this act, they created the Department of Canadian Heritage and 3 national Indigenous organizations: the Assembly of the First Nations, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Métis Nation of Canada. These legislations alone do not guarantee the survival of Indigenous languages, but it does help to raise awareness about these pressing matters. It begins with our youth and ensuring that they have adequate access to Indigenous language education both at home and at school.